Hello class and welcome to our lecture on government contracting. For this lesson I want to review government contracting from both an external and internal perspective based on the current trends in government. As such, I will address a short discussion of the history of government contracting and how contracting has evolved into what's called the contract state. I will then look at the benefits and detriments associated with this evolution, discuss how we as public servants can look to maximize the utility of the contract state, and then finally I'll engage in a discussion of the federal government's reliance on contracting to meet its mission and some ethical implications associated with that reliance. Government has been a major purchaser of goods and services for hundreds of years. From things as simple as paper clips to as complicated as aircraft carriers. Over the last 3 decades, contracting in government has expanded enormously, primarily to lower the size of government, outsource jobs, and gain efficiencies by doing this. In fact, in 1960, there were approximately 8 million government employees in the United States, with about 2.5 million serving in the federal government and the balance serving at the state and local government. Over time, that overall number has increased significantly to 22 million government employees in the U.S. However, the federal number has remained relatively static with only about 2.9 million employees, while at the state and local level, that number stands at just under 20 million. As an example, my team at CDC has 21 members on it, with half of them being contractors or fellows, and the balance being full-time CDC employees. As a result, there has been an increasing reliance on non-governmental entities to provide services directly to the public, resulting in the transformation of the public sector into what's called the contract state, with these contractual partnerships serving as the cornerstone of that state. The contract state first emerged to better control borrowing requirements for major infrastructure projects like toll roads, and port facilities. The term contract state refers to the partnerships developed between government and contractors, whereby they would form a partnership to share both the risks and rewards of the project between the public and private sector organizations. This basically provided private companies with access to tax breaks or annual revenues or taxpayer subsidies in exchange for assuming some of the risk and costs associated with the specific infrastructure project. That construct has evolved over the last 2 to 3 decades beyond infrastructure efforts to include the delivery of social and human services, typically in contracts between government and not-for-profit organizations. The evolution of the contract state has occurred at all levels of government across most developed democracies. This approach relies on market mechanisms to deliver goods and services through competitive contracting processes. It involves both secular and faith-based organizations. These goods and services can vary from health to elder care to child care and to education, just to name a few. There are a number of benefits and detriments associated with the evolution of the contract state, and I'll describe the most common benefits and detriments associated with this in turn. The first benefit is deemed to be economics, whereby the provision of these services through a contract state is cheaper because community workers are often paid substantially less than public servants. Next is the possibility for improved customer service, as often these nonprofits have more intimate connections to the community served, as well as a higher level of innate empathy towards the populations that they serve. The third benefit is deemed silo busting. Now, silo busting is a key criticism of government, particularly federal government, and I've heard it over the course of my 30-year career repeatedly. And this is a situation where silos have been built within government agencies through different funding streams. So to give you a real-life example, at CDC, I work in a national center focused on chronic disease prevention and health promotion. This center includes 9 separate divisions dedicated to addressing this one issue. We have divisions dedicated to addressing heart disease and stroke prevention, cancer prevention and control, and tobacco control, just to name a few. Their vertical focus for policymaking and budgeting can challenge our ability to coordinate efforts on chronic disease as a whole. And these conditions are often interrelated with each other, as tobacco use can be a risk factor for both cancer and heart disease and stroke. The use of nonprofits can help bust these silos by directing funds to these organizations for multiple projects across the spectrum of chronic disease prevention, enabling them to address a broad spectrum of chronic conditions using several funding streams from one government agency. And this really kind of puts the focus of the community organization's efforts at addressing chronic disease issues using those multiple funding streams, but in a way that breaks down that silo, because really they're serving as the focus of these funding opportunities and then disseminating out the prevention and control initiatives for that particular community. Now, a great example of how this works is CDC's breast and cervical cancer screening program and the Wise Women screening program focused on heart disease and stroke prevention. These two programs receive separate appropriation allocations and exist in separate divisions, but use the same community service providers for all their screening efforts. So what this means is the target population, underserved adult women, can access both cancer and cardiovascular health screening and any necessary follow-up health services in a one-stop shop, rather than having to see multiple providers supported by separate government funds. So this really, provides an efficient way for these women to access these screening services, and if they screen positive for any of these conditions, access health services through this program. Another benefit of the contract state is innovation, in that those closest to the service population should be encouraged to develop innovative approaches to service delivery and goods production. While this can happen, we will see later that it can also be a detriment, depending on the agencies supporting the effort. While these drivers certainly offer benefits to the goods and services delivery processes, there are some challenges associated with this approach. The first challenge is the social mission of not-for-profits results in their ability to underwrite the delivery of these services using volunteers and supplementing it by charitable giving. While this could be viewed from a positive aspect, this not-for-profit subsidy tends to cloud the true cost of the goods produced and the services provided. That subsidy is often built into the agreements between the service organizations and the government, and though not acknowledged within the contract, can result in a delivery system that is unstable and unsustainable during times when donations and volunteers become scarce resources for these organizations. The logistics can also be challenging in that these not-for-profit agencies will have to dedicate time and resources to competing for different pots of contractor grant funds, which can impact their ability to focus on their service population. As I previewed previously, innovation, while we have viewed this as a potential benefit, can also be a detriment, particularly when agencies manning the contracts or grants focus on contract management and accountability without accounting for accommodating an innovation component. One approach we've used at CDC is to fund existing entities or existing grantees with pilot program funds that are in addition to the normal funding mechanisms that we use with these grantees. These pilot funds serve as a way for the organizations to pursue innovation in a relatively risk-free environment while not endangering their primary funding streams. The evolution of the contract state into the delivery of goods and services is still a work in progress. Not-for-profit agencies benefiting from these arrangements need to do a better job of balancing their income streams so that they do not become dependent on government funding for their activities. And government needs to find ways to overcome risk aversion, bureaucracy, and lack of vision to truly tap the potential that these relationships have for improved goods and service delivery. And I think we've discussed previously the need to be a little bit more risk accepting amongst government employees in some of the previous discussions we've had throughout this course. The transition of the contract state into goods and social services is unlikely to recede anytime soon, given the pressures to control costs and the size of government. Therefore, the question becomes not whether or not the contract state will continue to exist, but how do we as public servants work to maximize the benefits of this approach for social services, in the same way it was maximized for large infrastructure projects? There are several strategies that can be employed by public servants to improve the performance of these social contracts moving forward. And these opportunities will likely present themselves to each of you as you transition into a public service career. These strategies include the following: embracing the partnership aspect of contracting by increasing the ability of not-for-profits to influence the policy parameters, administrative guidelines, and contractual conditions under which they operate. Effectively engaging these organizations to identify techniques for improving the contracting process with the goal of balancing the contractual relationship in a way that permits appropriate oversight, but also enhances collaboration between government agencies and social contractors is going to be essential to making the contract state most efficient in the future. Next, the promotion of innovation is the second strategy, which could be a byproduct of the first we just discussed. And this is to permit innovation and the identification of effective efficiencies in the goods and service delivery process. In other words, increase the willingness of government to embrace innovation as a component of the contract state. This will require a change in mindset amongst contracting officers who will need to be more flexible managing these social contracts and more willing to accept an increase in the risk that's associated with innovation, as we've previously discussed. Some of these approaches we have discussed earlier, pilot projects or innovation awards, should be part of this strategy, but it needs to be more than that. Government should look to these nonprofit organizations as untapped resources that can weigh in on the development of future projects and or programs by involving them to the extent possible in task forces and committees and developmental subgroups that are developing these contracts or grant awards. These organizations hold a wealth of experience that can and should be used to shape future endeavors. Next, government needs to improve the metrics used to measure the success of social goods and program delivery. What are the long-term benefits of government funding and innovation? How are government contracts or grants used to leverage additional funds to ensure appropriate service delivery? What is the true cost of these services? What was saved in the long term through government expenditures by early investment in social programs? As someone charged with educating decision makers on these types of metrics, I can say that there's a dearth of information on the long-term impact of these social investments on our society, and a high level of need to better document these benefits in order to truly describe the return on investment social spending can have on our society. Finally, government needs to be more creative about how these social goods and services are supported not only by the private sector, not only by the public sector, but also the private sector. How can we encourage the private sector to partner with the public and not-for-profit sectors to improve the impact of social programs? What innovative partnerships can be pursued to improve the reach and impact of these efforts? Are there better ways to fund these endeavors with new fundraising mechanisms like social impact bonds, pay for success bonds, or social benefit bonds? If we are to follow the infrastructure example that paved the way for the expansion of the contract state, wouldn't the use of SPLOS, Special Local Option Sales Tax, currently used for infrastructure funding in Georgia counties, be a viable option for building a social service infrastructure at the local level? I think these are all questions that the government's going to have to address moving forward. And this approach could really increase the resources available to government and not-for-profits and empower them to not only better document their successes and achievements, but also attract an increased level of community support through donations, volunteerism, and additional partnerships. Finally, I want to wrap this lecture up with a discussion of the current federal workforce and some of the ethical challenges associated with that blended approach that includes the extensive use of both full-time employees and contract staff. As my opening alluded to, the size of the federal workforce has remained relatively constant over several decades, hovering between 2.5 and 3 million since 1960. What that number fails to reflect is the increase in contracting and grant workforce supporting the federal government, which now stands at approximately 5.3 million staff, or over double the number of full-time employees working for the federal government. There are three drivers for this increasing reliance on contractors in the federal workforce. These drivers include demographic pressures, bureaucratic pressures, and political pressures, and I'll discuss each of these in turn. There are 5 demographic factors that contribute to the increasing reliance on contract staff in the federal government. The first is an outdated and inefficient HR process that can take, on average, 2 to 3 times longer to complete than the private, academic, or nonprofit sectors. These delays incentivize the use of contract staff who can be brought on much faster than any government HR system can, and with the equivalent credentials and experience necessary to do the job. A great experience of the HR challenges that we face in government is the use of Schedule A hiring. Now, Schedule A is designed to expedite the hiring process for qualified candidates that suffer from a documented disability. And in my office, we've used this process quite effectively to expedite the hiring process when we have vacancies. But even this approved and designated process for hiring can be frustrated by the imposition of additional requirements, like competing positions first through the regular hiring process, or extensively documenting a recruitment effort before being approved to hire through a Schedule A process. It's extremely frustrating and undermines morale on teams and amongst supervisors when you're forced to engage in these extra activities when you have a perfectly good process through Schedule A to use to kind of make the HR system more efficient. The second demographic factor is the aging workforce. The demographics in the federal workforce are skewed towards the older end of the spectrum, and while the workforce has had exceptional staying power, in other words, people who have stayed in the federal government for a long period of time, those who are likely to retire within the next 10 to 15 years will outstrip the cadre of young feds currently working in government. This will likely hit mid-level range the hardest, an area of the workforce already heavily populated by contractors. As retirements push federal employees up into management roles, these mid-level workforce challenges will likely become the area where you see an increased incentive to go the contractor route. The third factor is promotion within the federal government. The longer one stays in federal employment, the more likely it is you'll advance up the pay scales to higher levels. Promotion speed has been used as a retention incentive and may have caused some of the incentives to fill the mid-levels of federal employment left vacant with contract staff. The fourth factor is an antiquated and opaque performance management system that can generate inflated performance ratings. In fact, at CDC, a rating of achieved expected results, which is a numerical score of 3 on a 5-point scale, is often viewed as failure by most CDC staff. The appraisal system and its inflated scores makes it difficult to move poor performers out and bring in higher performers into government. And it also generates an incentive to keep contract staff on board so that you can avoid the utilization of this antiquated management system. Finally, the fifth factor in the area of demographic drivers is what is referred to as the hidden pyramid, a reference to the grade levels of federal employees. While the hierarchy resembled a standard pyramid in the 1940s, with most employees at the bottom of the pay scale in the pyramid, pay grade inflation has seen a decline in lower paid jobs and a more significant increase in the middle pay grades over time. In fact, now it is very rare to see any full-time employees hired as secretaries or administrative assistants, with those roles often filled by contract staff. As a result, the current pyramid looks more like an oval with a large number of feds paid at the middle level and a much less number at the bottom level and at the top level. In addition to the five demographic factors, there are also five bureaucratic factors that contribute to the increasing reliance on contract staff in the federal government. The first is the skills gap that exists in mission critical occupations. Linked to the demographic factors described above, the skills gap issue reflects an increasing imbalance between the demand for specialized skills in government, things like cybersecurity, information management, or acquisitions management, and the limited supply of personnel willing to join the ranks of the federal government. This is not a new challenge. In fact, it was identified as early as 2001 as an issue facing the federal government. But the problem has become increasingly more challenging as retirements ramp up in the federal government and the HR system becomes is mired in its inefficiencies. The second are barriers to federal employee engagement. As we've discussed in previous segments of this class, employee engagement is critical to high achievement and linked to both employee empowerment and employee inspiration. Utilizing the annual Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, a survey that looks at federal employee satisfaction across the federal government, the rates of empowerment and inspiration among the federal workforce are very low, with numerous factors supporting empowerment and inspiration, from management to resources to dealing with poor performers and to providing high quality goods and services, coming in at over 50% negative across the board. Alternatively, a vast majority of the respondents to the survey were positive about their own performance, expressed a willingness to put in extra effort, and were willing to be held accountable for their performance. This gap between empowerment and inspiration versus a willingness to engage will need to be addressed in order to improve government performance. It also stands in stark contrast with the private sector, where employees are both positive about the level of empowerment and inspiration generated by the employer and the capacity to perform their jobs to a high level. And this drives contracting because contractors aren't necessarily impacted by the challenges that a federal workforce faces. As was noted, private employees seem to feel very good about both their empowerment as well as their ability to perform, and that doesn't necessarily change working in a federal system, but it remains a challenge for the federal workforce. The third factor is the apples to oranges pay comparisons. Here we're looking at the assumption that contract staff are cheaper than full-time employees. This assumption has driven the increase in contracting staff over the past 3 decades, but it only holds up when you look at salary to salary comparisons. When you factor in overhead costs, the cost associated with contract staff almost doubles that of the federal employees. And so while this is often pointed to as a cost savings, the truth is it's probably a cost increase when you factor in all aspects of what it costs to bring a contract staff on board. Fourth is the weakened internal oversight. The utilization of internal auditing units like the Inspector General's office have waxed and waned depending on the administration in power. These offices have been impacted by several challenges, including the hiring issues described previously, variable support from one administration to the next, and to some extent self-inflicted wounds associated with padded investigatory results. While often placed in a challenging role, these offices can and should serve as a backdrop for the blurring lines between government and industry that often result from an increasing reliance on contract staff to perform government functions. And this lack of a backstop and lack of oversight can be used to promote the use of an increased number of contract staff internally. Finally, fifth is the sluggish presidential appointment process. Appointment delays inherent in every administration often create leadership challenges for federal agencies, particularly when 15 to 25% of these positions are vacant at any one time. This challenge creates an incentive for outsourcing these roles, even at the top echelons of government. In fact, early on in my career, I worked briefly for the Assistant Secretary for Legislation at the Department of Health and Human Services. And the individual in that particular Assistant Secretary role was a contractor, not an approved appointment or career staff person. Delays are associated with turnover and intra-branch power struggles, and this level of vacancy serves as a major obstacle to the advancement of any presidential agenda. And it often serves as a challenge for continuity purposes as well. A contract person could be there for a day, a week, a month. It's undetermined how long the appointment process will take and how long their contract is going to allow them to continue to do those jobs. Finally, there are 5 political factors that contribute to the increasing reliance on contract staff in the federal government. The first is the thickening of the leadership hierarchy, which represents the growth of political layers of the federal government. And to put this in stark terms, from 1961 to 2016, so from the presidency of John F. Kennedy through the presidency of Donald Trump, we've witnessed increases in the number of federal cabinets from 7 to 15, the number of layers available to presidential appointments from 17 to 71, and an increase in the total number of presidential appointments from 451 to 3,265. While these increases are substantial and were created by a variety of mechanisms, the inclination not to appoint creates breaks between the career federal employees and political appointees charged with carrying out the priorities of the administration. This is a challenge in that you can, again, increase the reliance on contractors sitting in some of these political roles as an interim basis, and really in serving as an obstacle to the full implementation of administrative priorities. The second area is the need to protect government achievements and fix breakdowns. The successes and failures of federal government create an unusual default position amongst political leaders. In that, successful projects are often looked to be replicated, and contract staff are often called upon to support those endeavors. Or, alternatively, unsuccessful projects typically cause politicians to call upon contractors to enter the fray and fix the issue. While oxymoronic on its face, this approach represents the need for politicians to demonstrate success and/or action in the face of failure, and the role contracting expertise can play in those political calculations. So in this instance, expertise is the gold of the realm and is used both for successes and failures to push the importance of contracting in those instances. The third area is public anger and frustration towards government. And this implicates the schizophrenic view that the public holds for government, often appreciating the programs that affect them the most, but viewing those who implement the programs with disdain and distrust. This polarized view of government creates incentive, again, to generate improved engagement with the public, which can drive the utilization of expert contractors to bolster both customer service and service delivery. And these contractors are often seen as alternatives to government employees who the public generally do not trust. Fourth is political polarization, and this reflects the increasing polarization we have witnessed in Washington over the last 30 years, which has often resulted in uncertainty about the future of both funding and programs within the federal government. This uncertainty and the desire amongst federal agencies to deliver on commitments made by Congress and the President has generated an increasing reliance on contractor employees who serve as a backstop to the unpredictable nature of today's politics. And I will say this, while the federal government budget is a complicated process, very inefficient, and often drags out way longer than it ought to, none of that changes the expectations that Congress and the President have on the performance of your programs. So this is a very real situation, and contractors can be used to ensure that some of these services continue even in an uncertain situation from a budget perspective. Finally, there are the most deadly adversaries of Republican government, which is reflected by Alexander Hamilton's reference to cabal, intrigue, and corruption that can make its way into the blended workforce of federal employees to contract staff. And this often makes this situation of the blended workforce unwieldy to manage. These challenges have existed since the start of the Republic, but identifying them and managing them can be a challenge. Efforts to manage these challenging issues are often impacted by some of the issues previously discussed. So, for instance, if we think back to 2008, when the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme was uncovered, we know that it was investigated a number of times by federal regulators. However, these regulators often lack the expertise and the sophistication to uncover the true nature of the scheme Madoff was running. And according to some accounts, were more interested in working for him than actually regulating his activities. This lack of expertise in these situations creates incentives to rely on contracting expertise rather than federal employees, something we discussed previously. And it's going to be more and more the case that we're relying on these expert contractors to engage in oversight that has traditionally been the role of federal employees. This lecture highlights the increasing role contractors play within the federal government as part of a blended staff, and outside the federal government as part of the contract state. While some continue to maintain that there is a wall between inherently government duties and the contractor duties, there is increasing evidence that this construct is outdated and overcome by the realities of 21st century governance. It may be time to adjust the reality of what government looks like in the 21st century, embrace it, and adjust to how we manage that system moving forward. Part of this effort will be to adopt a code of ethics that governs the performance of both federal employee and contractor in the government setting. By assuming contracts that perform public work, contracting agencies should be obligated to be more transparent in their operations to the public that pays them for those services. Contracting would appear to be a growing phenomenon in democratic societies, which the U.S. is leading. And while the increased reliance on contractors may not have generated the outcomes anticipated, the basic work of government is going to continue to rely on both employees and contractors, more so now than ever before. These agencies are rooted in public service, and refining what that means and how that is managed in the future is going to be essential for effective government. I want to thank you for your time and your attention. As always, if you have any questions about this lecture or any of the course material, please do not hesitate to contact me through my phone or through email. Thanks, and have a great day.